Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the NumberFire NFL Regrind Show, presented by RotoGrinders. I'm your host, Chris Jamino. You can find me on Twitter and on every DFS site as Chris Jamino. Joining me today to help us break down the Week 6 NFL action, Jim Sana, staff writer from NumberFire.com. Jim, what's going on?
It's all good, Chris. How you doing today?
Really, really good. Really close to a huge week, but can't complain. Still made some money. Feeling great.
Yeah, it's hard to complain when you know you were on the right plays at least. I know that, sometimes it can be a little bit tilting to look back and say what might have been. But at the same time, I mean, you have to feel good down deep inside at least. That's what counts, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Every lineup of mine, either the Lions or the Saints game, so feeling pretty good about the way things went on those calls. And also helping us break down the action this week for NumberFire, Editor-in-Chief, JJ Zachariason. JJ, what's happening?
Not too much. Just got done shower crying for the last 12 hours after watching my Steelers get destroyed by the Dolphins.
Yeah, that was a tough game. One of the things that you could have learned on NumberFire this past week was that the Dolphins had a 26.7% chance to win that game. So not a real likely outcome, to say the least. The Dolphins were able to get it done on your Steelers like that, JJ. But what we lose with our favorite teams maybe not performing so well, we can make up with positive fantasy results. Those are some things that you can help learn to do at NumberFire. Some other things you can learn at NumberFire right now is whether or not you should relax about Aaron Rodgers' slow start, whether or not Cody Kessler is for real, whether or not Brandon Gudula and his 20 offensive players in Week 6 are worth using go forward. And you could have actually seen that Atlanta is really highly rated in the net expected points matrix. I thought they were somewhat of a fraud. And if I would have looked more closely at NumberFire, I might have seen that, this type of positive offensive performance against the Seahawks, maybe that was somewhat predictable. JJ, why don't you tell us a little more about NumberFire?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you definitely gave some insight to it. There are things where we look at fantasy points against or some yardage data, and we think that that's the end all, and that's kind of how we judge our fantasy picks. But a good example is Brian Hoyer this past week, who played that Jacksonville secondary. He did throw for a lot of yards, but the Jacksonville secondary has also looked worse on paper against quarterbacks because they haven't given up a lot of touchdowns. Where you look at the NumberFire metrics, they actually ranked in the top 10 according to our schedule-adjusted metrics against the pass. And that could have gotten you off Hoyer a little bit if you were on him this week. So you can look at those on our team rankings page. For premium users, we have a bunch of tools where you can build optimal lineups based on trends, market shares, and differences that are going on within market shares throughout wide receivers, running backs, and even you can look at quarterback data as well. So all that behind a premium paywall, but there's a lot of free content on there as well.
Yep, and it's certainly there for NFL, but Jim, as you can attest, there's other things we can find on NumberFire, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it's not just the premium stuff. I mean, a lot of the free stuff is huge too. If you were looking at it this week, our games and lineups page has a look at weather, and that really did play a big part in how Week 6 panned out. I mean, if you look at that Miami game against Pittsburgh, the wind speeds all week, it was saying 15 miles per hour, and you don't want to use passing attacks in that type of wind. And I think that that's something that is definitely big for research. It's good to implement that. It played a role in the Chiefs-Raiders game too. So I think that, even if you're not willing to pay up for premium, I like the premium tools myself. But if you're not willing to pay for that, I mean, even the free stuff has a lot of viability that can help you steer away from potential, big old powder kegs for DFS.
Yep, guys. So go check them out. NumberFire.com. I was just on there a couple of minutes ago. Really, really, really enjoying the stuff they're putting out over there. And hopefully you can find a way to help yourself win as you move into Week 7. But before we can get to Week 7, we have to take a look at Week 6. We have to rewind all the way back to Thursday night, Jim, where your guy, Trevor Siemian, was unable to lead the Broncos to victory. It was the Chargers getting it done, 21-13. Jim, why don't you talk about the Broncos in that game?
Yeah, it was a weird game. I mean, not only were we – I was pretty excited to see what Simeon could do. I mean, he was back. He was healthy. He was facing a Chargers team with a secondary that really was missing a lot of pieces. But, I mean, kudos to San Diego. I think that Joey Bosa coming back has played a big role for them. But then just looking at Denver's usage, this is the first time the entire season Demaryius Thomas has out-targeted Emmanuel Sanders, but I don't think I'd be worried about that. Sanders had that hip issue. It seems like he'll be okay from that, and he still has a 27.8% target market share for the season. So I wouldn't worry too much about Manny. The one person who would benefit, though, it seems like if he were to go down besides Demaryius Thomas, is Jordan Norwood. He played 84% of the snaps in that game. He had 7 targets. So if, we check on Manny Sanders, see how his hip is doing, and if things take a turn for the worse, then Norwood's the guy you probably want to pick up. And then one final note here for the Broncos is that I was pretty worried about C.J. Anderson. If you look back to week 5, he played about 50% of the snaps, but in week 6, he bounced back to 78%, and he had a couple of long runs called back by penalty. The production wasn't really there, but I'm feeling better personally about CJA than I was heading into week 6 at least.
Yeah, certainly Devontae Booker, you see his name on the field more often, and you look at these snap counts, and it's a little bit – you feel better that it's not like a 50-50 split or a 60-40 or something like that. But, definitely C.J. Anderson, you kind of wish he was the lead guy, because if he was, he would be one of the top backs probably most weeks. JJ, when you look at how the Chargers played, though, it was a clean game for Phillip Rivers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they didn't use their wide receivers very often, which was kind of to be expected against this Denver defense where you utilize your tight ends a lot more. We saw that. Hunter Henry had another great game. Antonio Gates was involved as well. And then Melvin Gordon, Melvin Gordon has not been very efficient. We know that. He's at 3.4 yards per carry average right now. But at the end of the day, with fantasy football, what we care about most with running backs is volume, and what we care about is red zone and goal line touches. And he's had 16-plus carries in every game this season. He's seeing all the red zone touches. He didn't score a touchdown, so his performance wasn't that great this past week against a good Denver defense. But again, I don't think we should be overly worried just because he's been inefficient, just because there's not much competition there in that backfield. Yeah, and
another thing to maybe keep an eye out for is Hunter Henry and his usage over there in that passing game. I think that even though Gates is going to see the field plenty, I think that Henry's probably going to get mixed in with that offense as an integral part. So that's something else to pay attention to from the San Diego side. Heading out to New England, where the Patriots were able to defeat the Bengals, was a score of 35-17, and Brady was near perfect, Jim.
Yeah, he was, and that's kind of what we've seen in both the games so far this year, and probably should expect going forward too. And what that does is it gives such a boost to every asset in that offense for fantasy. We saw yesterday with James White. Not only did he get those 9 targets, a couple of touchdowns, which is good, but his usage was also really nice for the second consecutive week. And I don't know how much we can put on LeGarrette Blount's hip injury because that was a thing heading into week 5. But again, this week, Blount had 13 carries, even though they had control of that game probably from around midway through the third quarter on. And James White had 7 carries, also had 9 targets. I mean, I think if you're looking forward, James White is the guy I'd rather own. But in that backfield, even though LeBlanc will always have touchdown upside, he's not going to have the same floor that James White has. Looking at the rest of this offense, I think that there is still a bit of a reason to worry about Martellus Bennett. We saw him go down with an ankle injury early on in week 5. He came back and obviously was great, but it seemed as if the Patriots wanted to give him a bit of a break yesterday. Missed a good number of snaps in the first half, and then he had that Vontaze Burfict hit too, so another thing to track there with him, really awkward play. But then another person to touch on here with New England is Julian Edelman. 7 targets. The productivity hasn't been there in the 2 games Brady has played. His market share for the season is just 23.7%. I wasn't worried about Edelman heading into week 6, just because it seemed as if week 5 may have been a bit fluky. He still had the targets. He had 2 red zone targets and stuff like that. But my worry is starting to grow in a pretty quick manner.
Yeah, with the addition of the second tight end in that offense, with the addition of a healthy pass-catching back that Brady can trust, it's just more difficult to rely on Julian Edelman at this point in time. He was like maybe a couple of feet away from a touchdown pass that was designed for him at some point in the game. I remember seeing Brady just overthrown by a hair. But, like you were saying, Edelman's not going to be as consistent as we've known him in the past, and I think that's pretty safe to say. On the Bengals side, JJ, Giovanni Bernard led the way for the Bengals RBs. Any insight on what you think of that situation going forward?
Yeah, I think Jeremy Hill's still a little bit banged up, which is why Bernard's seeing the volume that he's seeing. Especially, I think the big sign of this was when they consistently fed him by the goal line, when they got that goal line stand. I think that it was very clear that Jeremy Hill is just not 100% right now. But even still, Gio Bernard on the year has just generally outperformed Jeremy Hill. And that even dates back to last year as well, with Jeremy Hill having a down season after his breakout year. So I would just keep an eye out on it. I think that Gio Bernard's just a better floor play week to week. Jeremy Hill obviously going to be a touchdown volatile player in that offense. So I think that's just basically the way that we have to kind of view it.
Yep. Can't really blame Dalton or AJ Green too much for this loss. I think that's probably just more credit to New England's defense in this particular spot. So on to the next game we go, where unfortunately it was the Dolphins getting it done against the Pittsburgh Steelers. JJ, it was a score of 30-15. And I could provide a number of different theories on why maybe Lawrence Timmons became ill during that game. But the number one answer is probably the fact that Big Ben's injured at the moment. Torn meniscus, talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, he could be back in a couple weeks. He's going to miss this weekend against the Patriots, which just means that Tom Brady is going. I mean, the whole New England offense and the defense now is in play in DFS. But the Steelers offense, we know that they have horrible home road splits. The Dolphins, though, look, they're coming off a big loss. I mean, they've been looking horrible, right, the Dolphins. But if you remember at the beginning of the season, they played well against Seattle in Seattle. They played well against New England in New England in that comeback that they were trying to put together. I think the Dolphins are a little bit better than what we probably give them credit for, number one. Number two, they got two big offensive line pieces back in this game, and that really, really helped Jay Ajayi control that game, rush for over 200 yards. There's injuries. Cam Hayward's been hurt for the Steelers. Ryan Shazier's been hurt. I mean, there's reason as to why Jay Ajayi was able to do what he did. It's just that we expected the Steelers offense to be able to move the ball against this Dolphins defense. And I think a lot of it had to do with Ben just didn't get in a rhythm early. Then he gets hurt. Then he comes off that. And he just didn't look the same when he came back into that game with that knee injury. He wasn't getting his accuracy was very off, and which is expected if you have a slightly torn meniscus, as he did. So I think it's just a game where the Steelers are going to try to forget it. But I do think that moving forward, maybe we shouldn't look at the Dolphins as this giant dumpster fire as we did maybe going into Week 6.
Yeah, a lot went their way, as you mentioned, but they're maybe not as absolutely terrible as we thought. I'm not sure what Byron Maxwell did to get good coverage on Antonio Brown. Maybe he found like a lamp and it was one of his 3 wishes or something like that. But it was just absolutely – it's like, sometimes things just go your way. And Byron Maxwell covering Antonio Brown well is pretty much things going your way. Any other notes here on this game from the Dolphins side, Jim? Ryan Tannehill, I guess, was fine.
Yeah, and I think that it goes back to what JJ was talking about. He was talking about their offensive line. They got Brandon Albert and Laramie Tunsil back, and this was the first game they've had those two, along with Mike Pouncey, all in the lineup at the same time. And what that does for the offense is it gives them higher efficiency, and that can lead to more volume for Jay Ajayi. And, I mean, we saw what he did there. He played 48 of 70 snaps. It seems like, they have fully ditched that committee, even with Arian Foster being there. So, I mean, it's going to be hard to find spots for Ajayi when you really like him because the offense really does have that dumpster fire potential on a pretty regular basis. But if they're facing a weak opponent, it makes sense. As long as they can keep Albert, Tunsil, and Pouncey all healthy, then I can see why you might get into them.
Yep, as long as they can stay careful in the shower, they'll be good to go.
Exactly.
So out in Washington, it was the Redskins getting it done against the Eagles. Score of 27-20. Carson Wentz was sort of limited by the game plan, JJ, and by the Redskins pass rush. Talk about the Eagles in this game.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was just a game script issue for Carson Wentz for sure. He showed some rookie mistakes early. It just didn't look great. But at the same time, I just think that the Redskins offense was able to sort of dominate this game and play really well on the ground especially. I mean, we saw Matt Jones had 16 attempts. Chris Thompson had 9. Rob Kelly even had 5. And they were able to move the ball against this Philly defense, which I certainly didn't expect them to be able to do. But we also know that the offense in general does have decent home splits under Kirk Cousins, which could have played a slight role here. And then, with the Eagles, look, I'm afraid of Ryan Matthews moving forward if you're trying to use him in DFS. He only played 11 snaps. Darren Sproles played 23. And obviously there's a negative game script there, but Wendell Smallwood actually was right there with Ryan Matthews in terms of snaps played. So I don't think that you can really get behind Ryan Matthews moving forward, even if you think that there's going to be a positive game script for the Eagles. I think the Eagles might have played a little bit over their heads to start the season and we might be holding on to that and thinking that this is the Eagles team that's going to be playing throughout the year. We have to keep in mind and keep a level head that this is a rookie quarterback. There are going to be games where they're not going to be leading the entire game, even in games where we think they're going to be. And as a result, Ryan Matthews just becomes pretty irrelevant in fantasy football.
Yeah, the backfield is certainly very tough to call at this moment. Ryan Matthews leading that backfield. Pretty much not enough to go around there. Too many mouths to feed, in my opinion. Lane Johnson also being, his loss being impacted already, as we saw in that game with pressure on Carson Wentz. Jim, talk about the Redskins.
Yeah, just one quick note on Lane Johnson. You mentioned this is his first game out due to that suspension, and the Eagles lost 6.85 net expected points due to sacks, which is a really big number for a single game. So, and he's out for 10 games. Like, there's still 9 more games left in his suspension. So that's not an issue that's going to get cleared up quickly, and they're facing the Vikings this week. So it could get really bad for that Philly offensive line, and it could get really bad for Carson Wentz as a consequence of that. But looking at Washington, I think that I had been a little bit concerned about Matt Jones last week, and I know that the yardage total was very good this week, but I'm still kind of concerned about him. He lost 9 carries to Chris Thompson. He had 5 to, like JJ said, 5 to Robert Kelly. And Kelly, he's taken 3 red zone rushes. Thompson has 2. There are a lot of reasons to be worried about Matt Jones, and Chris Thompson outsnapped Matt Jones too. I was big into him 2 weeks ago, and I, in general, am a big Matt Jones believer because I think that offense is pretty good. But I think that there are enough red flags here where I'm starting to want to divest a bit from Matt Jones. JJ called it a couple weeks ago, saying to sell Matt Jones. And I think that I'm very much more in that basket now than I was previously, especially coming off of a big game against Philadelphia. But as far as the rest of the offense, I think the big benefactor of Jordan Reed being out is Pierre Garçon. I mean, we've really seen him stabilize from what was a rough beginning to this season. He had a season-high 11 targets in this game. He now leads all receivers on this team for the entire season, mind you, with a target share of 19.6%, which is a good number. Deshaun Jackson second at 18.6. Jamison Crowder is third at 15.9. I think that Garçon is, he's becoming a very much fantasy relevant receiver in that offense. I think that, if you need to use him, there are worse things you could potentially have, looking at that offense.
Yep, definitely hard to trust anyone outside Jordan Reed, but you mentioned Pierre Garçon. If this continues, maybe we can get him on the cheap in DFS go forward. We'll have to keep an eye out on that situation. In New York, JJ, it was the Giants defeating the Ravens 27-23. And how about that Odell Beckham Jr. getting off the schneid here with a couple of big plays? Talk about the Giant offense. What did you see during that game?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing with OBJ is that he had a similar market share up until, I guess last week he scored as well against the Packers. But he had a similar market share, and similar yardage totals. He just wasn't finding the end zone. Now we're seeing a little bit of positive regression for him in finding the end zone. He did against the Packers. He obviously did twice, and these are 2 big plays where you can't really predict that. But the matchup was decent against a pretty bad Baltimore secondary in terms of personnel. So I think that certainly helped. But yeah, I mean, I think overall they're doing what they should be doing, and that's feeding their best player in the offense. He now has over a 26% market share, which is perfect for a guy like Odell Beckham.
Yeah, and it doesn't really hurt the Giant passing game that their rushing attack is just pretty bad at this point in time. I think maybe Lawrence Timmons maybe spotted them on the big screen or something. Maybe that's why he got sick. I don't know. But, Jim, you can't use any of these guys, right?
I don't know. It's so hard to trust anything. And Baltimore has a really good defense. And I think that we underrated them heading into the season. So, I mean, at least outside of the cornerbacks, obviously, but I mean, it's hard to get to overreact too much. But looking at the usage, there's not a lot to like. Rashad Jennings gave up 6 carries to Bobby Rainey, who is, more of a pass catching back, gave up 2 to Paul Perkins. Jennings did have 4 targets, which is nice, which was more than either Rainey or Perkins. But until I see a reason to change my perception of Rashad Jennings, a guy who I liked a lot coming into the season, it's really hard to have a lot of faith in them. And really, that's kind of true for a lot of the pieces outside of Odell Beckham in this offense. Sterling Shepard's production has been down recently. He still has at least 7 targets in every game except for week 1. So if I'm choosing between him and Victor Cruz, it's Shep for me, 10 times out of 10. And then One other guy I'm watching in this Giants offense is Larry Donnell. He came back from that concussion that he had against the Vikings, and he had a season-high 7 targets in his first game back, and Will Tye had just 2. We hadn't really seen a split between those two guys before that. Tye has struggled overall this year with his productivity when he has gotten targets, so I think it would make sense for Donnell to pull back away. But again, it's something that, just like with Rashad Jennings, where I want to see it before I start to act upon it.
Definitely. Just you would like to see some sort of evidence of consistency there. JJ, we know that Terrence West has sort of taken control of the Raven backfield temporarily, but what about the passing attack? Joe Flacco wasn't very good. And what do you see over there with the Ravens passing game?
I mean, they have a good matchup next week against the Jets, a team that just gets torched with big plays. And we obviously know that Joe Flacco has a big arm, that he can take advantage of that. But I think overall, this is something that we're saying each and every week, is that they have an offense that lacks real star power. I mean, he's throwing the ball to an aged Mike Wallace and to Kamar Aiken this week. And look, Kamar Aiken, while a lot of us want him to get more snaps, Kamar Aiken certainly isn't a measurables freak by any means. So I think that they just need those weapons. And he's also throwing to Dennis Pitta, who we've joked about having an 80-year-old hip. So I think a lot of it is a combination of, they're learning a new offense now, or they have a slightly different offense without Mark Trestman. And then they also just don't have very strong weapons. And we know that Joe Flacco himself isn't this guy who's consistent week to week to begin with. So I think overall, Flacco's definitely more of a season-long guy than a guy that I'm really confident in targeting from a DFS perspective.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Flacco and the weapons in Baltimore just not all that easy to trust. Heading out to the next game, guys, let's take a look at how Jacksonville defeated the Bears 17-16 in a somewhat ugly game. Jim, Cameron Meredith does it again, thanks to some Blake Bortles, some Brian Hoyer garbage time there, driving him down the field at the end. But what can you make here of Cameron Meredith, though? Do you think this is going to continue with this guy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's no reason to think that he won't. He now has 27 targets the past 2 games, 15 back on Sunday. And this is one thing that Brandon Gadula was focusing on, our colleague at NumberFire, was kind of, how he stepped in and replaced Kevin White. They didn't really overlap a whole lot. And heading into this week, Brandon noted that they had, more targets than everyone in the NFL if you combine their totals than one, except for one guy. So this is a role in this offense that you want to target right now. Cam Meredith is the guy who is filling it. And I think that the productivity is there. The measurables are there too. So you really do have to buy into Cam Meredith. But also I think we do have to note that this was a good game for Alshon Jeffrey's usage too. Finally, 13 targets for him. I've been waiting for that the whole year. That was almost double as many as he had the entire season. His previous high was 7. He had 13 there. Zach Miller, double-digit targets for the first time for him. And I think that what you like about this Bears offense is that where the ball is going to go. It's going to go to Meredith, Jeffrey, or Miller, pretty much if they're going through the air. And, while we may not know week to week who is going to be the main guy, we do know that those guys are at least going to see targets on a week-by-week basis, which does have value in fantasy.
Yeah, definitely some encouragement there with Meredith having another game here, with the targets being sort of consolidated a couple of key guys. Not as encouraging was Kadeem Carey kind of suctioning away some of Jordan Howard's work in that, so we'll have to stay tuned there. That was disappointing. I was a big fan of Howard coming into the week. Someone I'm not a big fan of at the moment, JJ, is Blake Bortles. He just looks bad out there. He looks like he has Tebow mechanics. Talk about Blake Bortles and what's the problem with this guy?
I mean, look, Blake Bortles has never had good pocket awareness ever. I think that what we're seeing here is a guy who, from a fantasy perspective, is regressing, and a defense that's playing slightly better than they did last year. So you're not getting as many of those super, super negative game scripts for him. I mean, he's not utilizing Allen Robinson nearly enough this season in terms of his red zone usage either. Allen Hurns has a larger market share in the red zone right now than Allen Robinson does. Tavon Austin has a bigger market share in the red zone than Allen Robinson does right now. And it's not like Allen Robinson's target market share in the red zone is horrible. It's just that we know that he's elite in the red zone, despite the drop that he had that led to an interception this past week against the Bears. You can forget that. But we know that Allen Robinson is elite wideout. I think that they just need to focus a little bit more on him in the red zone. And hopefully that can bolster Blake Bortles' numbers a bit. But look, this is a really good matchup for Bortles, and he certainly did not come through. And I don't know how you can really trust him moving forward.
Totally agree there. Speaking of things that you can't trust moving forward, Jim, the Jaguars running back situation, that's not very good either.
No, they had said heading into this weekend that Chris Ivory was like the go-to back, and all of a sudden, that TJ Yeldon was the go-to back, which is what we saw in London. So I was like, okay, we can buy into this. Awesome, some clarity. And then, nope, just kidding. They give Ivory 11 carries compared to Yeldon 6. They both had 2 targets, which is the area where you would expect Yeldon to pull away. That didn't happen. Ivory had 2 goal line carries. I don't know how to dissect that at all. And I mean, it's not as if either of them is being productive, and they lost Luke Jokel, their guard. I believe he's on IR now. So there's really not a lot to love there. And I can't buy into it. I mean, you should own Ivory if he's available in the league. It's because he's seeing volume, but I don't know how to make of that situation at all. And it's not as if like they're playing well enough to where you're going to get, useful running back volume either.
And this is also coming off a week where they reported that TJ Yeldon was going to be the every down back for them. I mean, it's the most ridiculous thing that I've seen in a while.
I am certainly disappointed by the whole situation in Jacksonville right now. It's very Timmons-worthy, so let's get off that situation and jump on to one that is much better to talk about from a fantasy perspective, and that is the Saints triumphant over the Carolina Panthers. The 1-5 Carolina Panthers. Wow. 41-38. JJ, talk about this game. This game was a lot better than the last one we talked about.
Yeah, this was awesome. This was filled with fantasy goodness that we all projected for it to be. I mean, it was a high-scoring game. That's exactly how we thought it would be. It would play out with those bad Carolina corners. I think that the one thing that we can take away is not, obviously not just the home road splits for the Saints offense, and not even just specifically Brandon Cooks, but Brandon Cooks is so good when his matchup is so easy. When Brandon Cooks faces a Desmond Trufant or a Jason Verrett with half an ACL, Brandon Cooks doesn't perform. But when Brandon Cooks gets these mediocre corners from Carolina, he's going to perform, and that's exactly what he did. So I think that's definitely something positive to take away for him. That he is fairly predictable. He does put up those duds, but he is pretty predictable. Mark Ingram. Again, he's not scoring touchdowns, which is frustrating, but he still has a decent market share within that offense. The thing is that he didn't see much volume through the air. Travaris Cadet was seeing some looks there. Some of the Cadet looks also, though, were towards the end of the game when they were in more of a hurry up to get that last-second field goal. And then on the other side, you have Kelvin Benjamin. He's seeing a bit of a touchdown regression from the start of the season, but his market share is still over 22%. He's still seeing good volume in that offense with a good quarterback, so he should be fine moving forward. And then J-Stu. I know Jim was really into J-Stu this week. Look, he saw goal line touches, which is really important and good to see. My only hesitation is that it was against the Saints. That's really the only reason I would feel super optimistic about J-Stu. I do think that when they face tougher competition, he might not get as many opportunities down at the goal line. And when they are at the goal line, it's going to be the Cam Newton show, as we saw towards the end of that game when Newton rushed one in.
One thing I want to point out from this game, because it's sort of my area of expertise, is the ownership that came out from this game when it came to the pass catchers in New Orleans. I think that most people would have assumed this game would have been somewhat highly owned. And you guys like Thomas did get a little bit of ownership because of their price. But Cooks was like 7.5% on some sites. There was just a noticeable drop in ownership based on what we would have expected for a game like this, just based on the fact that the Saints spread the ball so much. Jim, can you talk about that at all as far as how the Saints distribute their passing and rushing attack?
Yeah, I think that's kind of, it goes back to what JJ said, is you can kind of predict it, based on the matchup of Brandon Cooks. And if he's in a good matchup at home, you have to invest, and I think that he's safer then. It is still a bit unpredictable, though, regardless. If you look at their target market shares for the entire season, nobody in that offense is above 19%. In that, usually if you want a wide receiver one, they're around like 25-ish% or so. And there's no one really close to that. So I think that when Cooks is at home, you definitely do want to invest, but there's still a bit of an element of unpredictability. So I get why people wouldn't want to invest, but at the same time, there's a reason that that he is regarded as highly as he is, and it's because he can do stuff like he did in that game. And when it comes to the backfield for the Saints, again, it is hard to figure out who's going to get the ball in close. They've got John Kuhn with 4 red zone carries. Daniel Lasco has 3. Tim Hightower has 3. Mark Ingram, I believe, has 8 so far this year. So it is kind of hard to figure out where the ball is going. But the good thing from this game, like JJ mentioned, Jonathan Stewart, it was something you wanted to monitor, with Cam Newton coming off that concussion. You wanted to see what the usage would be like. And if you look at just this game, Jay Stu had 19 of 23 running back carries in his first game back. He had 4 red zone carries, and 3 of those came from inside the 5-yard line. So even if Cam Newton did get one of those carries, there's still enough usage from Jay Stu as opposed to Mike Tolbert, where you can buy into him, especially if they have games where they're going to be in positive game flow.
Yeah, it was good to see there. Stewart coming back and helping that offense. Hopefully it can help them turn their season around because, quite frankly, they needed him. They need a running game. Devin Fudge just stinks, guys. I mean, the passing game just isn't going to work as well if the running game is not working the way it was last year. And the bottom line is they need that kind of help on their team. Anyone got any final thoughts? JJ, anything else you see from this game we didn't talk about?
Just laughing at Jim's comment about Mark Ingram not seeing the goal line touches because you forgot Kobe Fleener too, Jim.
Yeah, I forgot. The goal line carries for Kobe Fleener.
Yes. Yeah. The goal line carries for Kobe Fleener are important as well.
All right, guys. So let's move on to the next game. Fantasy goodness abound in this game, too. It was the Lions defeating the Rams 31-28. Jeff Fisher was disgusted with all the fantasy production and scoring production his team was getting. But in the end, they were finally able to pull off the defeat, JJ. Talk about the Rams in this spot here. They actually were able to produce some offense here, much to Jeff Fisher's chagrin.
I think a big thing to take away is that the Lions secondary is absolutely atrocious. Probably the worst in the NFL right now. Entering the week, them in the Indianapolis Colts were bottom 2 according to NumberFire metrics. I would assume that when our numbers are fixed tomorrow and released, that they will be dead last within the schedule adjusted metrics. Case Keenum was able to tear them apart. I was surprised that Kenny Britt was the guy that saw the work that he did because I was assuming that Darius Slay would see him a bit. But I do think that, look, they're going to see negative game scripts in this offense because the defense isn't playing as well as it did last year. The defensive line is banged up. They have some issues. So they're going to see negative game scripts. The problem is it's kind of a rotation and carousel as to who's seeing a lot of these looks. Some weeks it's Brian Quick. Some weeks it's Kenny Britt. Some weeks it's Tavon Austin. And so, they're obviously, even without that, they're more of a GPP kind of offense. But I do think that there can be some production there when they're facing a bad defense like the Lions and facing an offense like the Lions that can keep up the pace. And then, Todd Gurley just continued to be incredibly touchdown dependent where he didn't really produce. The positive is that he did see 4 targets with Benny Cunningham healthy, which I expected him to see maybe just 1 or 2 because Jeff Fisher doesn't like using his best players. But I do think that Gurley, again, completely touchdown dependent. He got stuffed on that 4th down at the end of the first half. Which certainly didn't help his fantasy production. But he's certainly not in that elite tier, or even close to that elite tier right now in fantasy football. Yeah,
and, Gurley's definitely in a tough spot right here in this Ram offense. Still using Benny Cunningham crowbarred in there yet again. Made sure he comes off the field on 3rd down. It was just overall just not a good situation for the running attack in there in Los Angeles. When it came to the passing game, of course, you mentioned the Detroit defense is really bad. Talk about the Detroit offense, though, Jim. They came through in a big way, Matthew Stafford especially.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that goes down to the injuries for Los Angeles. I mean, everyone on their defense is hurt, it seems like. So this is not just a one-week thing for Detroit. I mean, their offense is good, so it's not like totally discrediting them, but you're going to want to watch the practice reports for the Rams coming forward because they had a lot of dudes who were on it this week and then also missed the game on Sunday. So I would be watching that, especially Tremaine Johnson. If he continues to miss time, that could be a big issue for them. But, this Detroit offense, I don't know what to take away from this game because it seemed kind of fluky from a usage standpoint. You'd assume that Dwayne Washington will be back at some point. So it's hard to get too excited about Zach Zenner. Saw a ton of snaps, which is good. He did out-carry Justin Forsett 14-5. So there are positives, but then when you throw Theo Riddick back in there eventually and Dwayne Washington back in there, then we don't know what the usage will look like then. So I honestly don't know what to take away from this game from the running backs. As far as the wide receivers, though, Golden Tate's 10 targets, the most of the season. That brings his market share back up to 19.9%, but it is so hard to trust him. I mean, his floor is non-existent on a week-to-week basis. So I don't see myself really buying too much into Golden Tate at the moment. The one takeaway I'd have from the receivers is that I'm worried a little bit about Marvin Jones. You look at his target market share over the past 4 games, it's down to 20%, and he was, around 23% heading into last week overall. So he seemed as if he was going to be a solid target monster, but I would bet that defenses are starting to account for him more because he is a more talented receiver than Golden Tate. So it would make sense for them to focus in on Marvin Jones, but that could be an issue for fantasy if they decide to overload his way. So I'm a little bit nervous about Marvin Jones going forward just because it seems as if he's starting to draw more attention.
Yep, definitely used some Marvin Jones yesterday in my Matthew Stafford lineups, and it was disappointing. But thankfully, did get some Golden Tate in there, who rose from the dead. Like the Undertaker in the center of the ring, sat straight up, and all of a sudden he's back. Anyway, the Lions overall got it done the big way for fantasy, and we'll have to keep an eye out for all those things you mentioned, Jim, moving forward. Going to have to pick up the pace a little bit here as we talk about the Niners and the Bills. It was the Bills dominating that game. It was a score of 45-16, and as predicted, JJ, all LaShawn McCoy. Talk about it.
Yeah, all the shady McCoy. Look, whenever you face the 49ers, you know that your offense is probably going to play at a slightly faster pace. And then you add that to the fact that their rush defense is absolutely atrocious now. It's going back the last 5 games, if you exclude that week 1 sort of anomaly, if you will, against the Rams. Fozzie Whitaker had 16 carries for 100 yards. Kristen Michael, 106 yards and 2 scores. Ezekiel Elliott, 138 yards and 1 score. David Johnson, 157 yards and 2 scores. And then obviously Shady this past week with 140 yards and 3 scores. Look, I mean, they faced really good running back competition in running games. But this is a defense that you 100% can target with your fantasy running backs. And if Doug Martin's back this week, they're playing them in San Francisco. He could be a really, really interesting play.
Tampa Bay definitely needs Doug Martin back. That's for another show, though. Jim, talk about the 49ers, or really, actually don't talk about them. Just give us the really short synopsis. This was a terrible game. Colin Kaepernick's not good. What else can we learn about the 49ers from this game?
I didn't think Kaepernick was that bad, considering the wind was atrocious for that game. It was like 18 miles per hour. The Bills' defense isn't really that bad either. Kaepernick had negative 1.5 passing net expected points and a 41.9% success rate. Not good, but it's better than Blaine Gabbert. So I think that, you would assume they'll continue to start Cap, and that could be hard for Jeremy Curley. His, 7 targets, not a lot of productivity, and Torrey Smith, it made sense. You would have expected his productivity to go up with Cap. It did. 7 targets for him, his most since week 2. Quentin Patton had 7 targets as well, a season high for him. It would seem as if with Kaepernick in there, they're going to be skewing more towards guys like Torrey Smith. And I'm not saying this for any particular reason, just throwing it out there. They're playing an atrocious secondary coming up this week. So if you want to get a little weird, don't say I told you to do it, though. If it goes badly, I promise it's not my fault. I'm just saying.
It's not too early in the week for a hot take, so let's just go ahead and get that out of the way right now.
Stacks for days.
Jim has said he's going all in on the 49ers next week.
Whoa. I didn't go that far. Hands off at this point.
Okay, so he backs down a little bit, but at the end of the day, 49ers, they're still a struggling team. Could have a nice matchup next week per Jim Sonis, ladies and gentlemen. So on to the next game. It was the Titans. They defeated the Browns 28-16. DeMarco Murray surprisingly struggled a little bit in this game, JJ, but overall, it was still the Titans getting it done where they were supposed to.
Yeah, look, the Browns' rush defense has actually been a lot better than what people are giving them credit for this season. A lot of it has to do with positive game scripts for the opposite team. But in this one, it was fairly close. They didn't need Murray all that much. The biggest disappointment for me, I think that you guys will probably agree, was Delaney Walker. I don't know if his hamstring is still part of the issue and what's going on there. But he just didn't get it done for them in what was a beautiful, beautiful matchup. Every tight end has been destroying this Cleveland Browns defense. So that was something that was a little frustrating. The wide receiver situation in Tennessee is still a dumpster fire. Kendall Wright only played 35% of the team snaps despite outperforming every other wide receiver in that game. So he was 4th in the pecking order at wide receiver, but he outperformed every other wide receiver on the team. So just avoid that week in and week out. And then on the opposite side, Isaiah Crowell now has 2 bad games in a row against 2 decent rush defenses. New England, obviously, a good rush D. Tennessee is pretty good at stopping the run as well. And so, I think that we're kind of seeing him what we expected out of a Browns running game, especially because they're going to be trailing a lot. And then Terrell Pryor, man, just keeps getting it done. Top 10 in market share and red zone usage at the wide receiver position. Of course, when Corey Coleman eventually gets back, things could change a bit. But right now, Terrell Pryor is playing out of his mind. I expect Terrell Pryor to be their number one when Corey Coleman comes back because he's playing that well. And you can't fight against the amount of volume that he's seeing and the usage that he's seeing, even with Cody Kessler, who, as Jim wrote on NumberFire today, a very underrated Cody Kessler, despite him being under center for them.
All right, Jim, talk about Cody Kessler. What did you see?
He's been really good so far, and I don't want to get too excited because it's not as if he's faced the toughest defenses so far. So it's not, we do need to qualify for that. But at the same time, he's got a really bad situation there. I think the left guard, Joel Bitonio, is out for a while now with a foot injury, which could hurt Crowell, but it also hurts Cody Kessler. And he got sacked a bunch against Tennessee. But still, if you look at his NumberFire metrics, his passing at expected points per dropback is right near Carson Wentz. He's very good there. And his success rate is actually well above Carson Wentz. He's above average there. He's above average in his overall passing efficiency. And that's all without Corey Coleman because Coleman broke his hand before Kessler became the starter for Cleveland. So there's a lot to like there. If I'm dishing out hot takes for week 7, might as well look forward to week 8 too. Not that I've looked, but they're facing the Jets. And, Coleman might be back then. So if you want to get weird and use Cody Kessler in fantasy, I think your opportunity is 2 weeks around the corner. But in all seriousness, he has been very good. And I think that does help Terrell Pryor a lot, not only with his volume, but his efficiency will be higher, gives him more touchdown potential. And that is something you want for a guy whose price has gone up as much as it has for Terrell Pryor.
Yep, so good stuff there on Cody Kessler, and we'll look forward to a couple weeks there. Maybe if we're desperate, we can fire away a Cody Kessler share or two per Jim once again with the Niners and Browns takes. I love it. Let's get into the next game, though. It is the Chiefs who were able to stomp the Raiders 26-10 on the road, no less. And JJ, I think that this is like the most Andy Reid, Alex Smith game imaginable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're coming off a bye. They played good defense. The weather was pretty poor, which definitely helped, them keep Derek Carr off the field. I'm still tilting over the Dontari Poe touchdown, though, which was clearly a forward pass in my eyes for those of you who streamed Alex Smith this week. But yeah, I mean, look, positive game script for this Chiefs offense results in a lot of rushing. So Spencer Ware saw the field a lot more. He's played 25 more snaps than Jamal Charles did, but Jamal Charles looked great. So I would expect Jamal Charles to continue to dig into Spencer Ware's workload as the season progresses. But yeah, I mean, I think that the expectation with any Alex Smith game specifically, or any game where you expect more passing with the Chiefs offense, is that you hope that the opposing offense is going to score a lot of points as well. So if you look back to the Steelers game a couple weeks ago, where Alex Smith is going to Heinz Field, the Steelers are going to put up a ton of points. That's when you want to play a guy like Alex Smith. And you kind of had that same feeling, or at least I did this week with the Chiefs. But of course, whether it's the weather, the Chiefs coming off that bye, I think the defense just played really well as well. Derek Carr didn't look perfect. It didn't look like he did through the first 5 weeks of the season, that's for sure. And he looked like he was targeting Amari Cooper a little too much. It was a little bit too obvious at some points in that game. So I think overall it was a great game script and a great outcome, obviously, for Chiefs fans. But I think from a fantasy perspective, anytime that you see such a positive script for the Chiefs, it's bad news. Bad news.
Yep, it was, there was some promise early in the game for a guy like Amari Cooper on the other side that maybe they would keep this game a little bit closer. It didn't end up being the case. It was the Spencer Ware show. It was Jamal Charles getting, maybe about 11 touches. Jim, talk about just what you saw from Jamal Charles in his limited action.
Yeah, I think, like JJ said, he was really good. And the thing that's encouraging for me, if I'm a Jamal Charles owner, which I might be a couple of places, one or two, is that if we look at just the first half when that game was very close, the carry distribution was a lot closer in that game. You look at the first half, 8 carries for Spencer Ware compared to 6 for Charles. He only played 15 snaps overall, but you could look at that game and say, well, they had a lead. It was awful, awful, awful conditions. Maybe they thought that they want to conserve Jamal Charles. So it is a down game for Charles' usage, and it does worry me a bit. But I think overall, it's not something where you want to panic too much from this one. It's hard to draw conclusions overall because of all the high wind and rains that were going on during that game. I think that the positives for Oakland's side are Amari Cooper, his market share is 26.8%, and then also DeAndre Washington in a game where you would expect them to use Jalen Richard, their pass catching back, more. He had 10 carries compared to 4 for Richard. And Richard, he did have 3 targets compared to 1 for Washington. But, if Latavius Murray is not able to come back, I definitely do think we can have a lot more optimism in DeAndre Washington going forward.
Yep, so we'll have to make sure that we're cognizant of the situation with Latavius Murray's health go forward. Speaking of going forward, let's go out to Lambeau, where it was let's go out to Seattle first, where it was the Seahawks defeating the Falcons 26-24. And the Falcons were consistent but not amazing on offense, JJ. So talk about how they kept this game close and how Matt Ryan continues to get it done from an efficiency standpoint.
Yeah, I think it starts with their offensive line. That's been a big difference for them this season. Obviously, anytime you can go to Seattle, that Seattle defense is going to perform in one way or another. But I think that everything's coming together very well for this offense, and it starts with that offensive line. Devontae Freeman, to me, has been the superior back in this offense, and he out-touched Tevin Coleman pretty dramatically in this one from a ratio standpoint. He saw 12 carries to Coleman's 5, and he saw 5 targets to Coleman's 2 targets. I think that they're probably going to continue to lean on Freeman a little bit more moving forward. But I actually think from a fantasy perspective, we can look at this Falcons offense and say that it was a win. I think that this Falcons offense is one that is a top 5 one in the NFL that we can target week in, week out. Julio Jones being as involved as he was with that matchup against Richard Sherman was very, very positive and very, very good. So I think that overall, despite the loss, and it was a controversial loss even, despite the loss, I think that we have to feel pretty good about everyone in this Falcons offense, maybe aside from Tevin Coleman.
Yeah, and I think with the Ben Roethlisberger potential injury situation here, Julio Jones could be ready to step up as the top receiving option in fantasy here. And not that that's a hot take or anything like that, but it's just worth noting that he's basically going to be the top raw scorer go forward, in my opinion. Jim, why don't you talk about the Seahawks though, because once again they were also fairly consistent, but they've got Christine Michael playing really well.
Yeah, he's really good. And the thing about him, too, is that he still has more time before Thomas Rawls get back. But even when Rawls is back, it might not matter because Michael has been so good. He had 18 of 20 running back carries. I'm sure that the C-Mike owners are a bit frustrated that Alex Collins got one on the goal line, his only carry of the game, though. So it's a negative short term, but I think that long term, C-Mike, if you're a believer, you should be very excited about what's happened so far this year. But that's not to say that C.J. Spiller doesn't have a role in that offense. He did have 6 targets in week 6. He had 3 the week before their bye week, I should say, coming to that team. And I think that until C.J. Prosise is healthy and maybe even after that, Spiller is going to have some sort of role in that offense when they do need to throw. And the same can be said for Jimmy Graham. You look at the last 3 weeks, he has at least 8 targets in each of those games, or the last 3 games, I should say, because they had their bye too. And I think that his emergence is going to play a factor not only for himself, but also for Doug Baldwin, a guy who I was super into last week because he has these grotesque home road splits and he always plays so well at home. But if you look at his last 3 or his 5 games this year, he has 6 or fewer targets in 3 of those games. And the other times he's been in double digits. So I think he's a lot less predictable than he may have been last year. And that for me is definitely worrisome because Doug Baldwin's a guy who I liked a lot coming into the year.
Yep. So that's once again good news for Jim Graham, but not so good for a guy like Doug Baldwin in that office, and certainly not good news for a guy like Tyler Lockett, who has all but disappeared temporarily. We'll see if that continues as well. Let's jump out into our last 2 games here, starting with Lambeau Field, where it was the Cowboys defeating the Packers 30-16. JJ, Dak had not thrown an interception in his career until he was touched by Brett Favre on the shoulder. I saw a great gif about that today. But why don't you talk about Dak, though? He got it done. The Cowboys look great.
Yeah, the Cowboys do look great. I think Dak is perfect for the system right now and for Ezekiel Elliott. And look, I think a lot of folks also were pushed away from this matchup against Green Bay because of where Green Bay ranked in terms of yardage against. But if you look at who Green Bay faced up until that matchup, they had the Jags, who obviously haven't been able to run the ball. The Vikings have had struggles running the football. The Lions have had some struggles running the football, and the Giants, who we talked about earlier, having just being a dumpster fire in terms of their backfield. So those are four really, really easy rush defenses to stop. So I think that there was a little bit of noise there. So when we look at what Zeke was able to do, which is what he's been doing the last few weeks, it shouldn't be as big of a surprise. Certainly a surprise, though, considering they did see a nice positive game script where I think, the thought was that the Green Bay offense was going to be able to move the ball at least better than they did. But that Green Bay offense just isn't looking like it did in 2014 with Jordy Nelson.
No, it's really not. And, you mentioned, the Cowboys just having Elliott and the elite O-line is just a combination that is much, much better than the offenses they'd seen to that point in time. So clearly, the game script didn't work out the way he thought it was going to. And Aaron Rodgers, Jim, is just not playing well.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird because he's around league average right now. His passing and expected points per dropback is exactly the league average, and his success rate is a bit below it, but that's not what you expect from Aaron Rodgers, who is one of the best quarterbacks of all time. And you kind of want to see it again before you buy into him specifically. And the problem is that their offense is really banged up. Eddie Lacy, even though he was the only healthy running back and quote unquote healthy, he wasn't able to play a lot of snaps because he had, I think, an upper body injury at some point in the game too. He had the ankle issue that was going on. So you saw a lot of Ty Montgomery in the backfield as a running back for the Packers, and it really benefited him. 12 targets. He also had 3 carries. If they have more injuries going forward, and it seems like James Starks will be out for a while now, Ty Montgomery could be a guy that you want to look at just because it seems as if he'll be kind of like a pseudo pass-catching running back, the same way they had used Randall Cobb in previous years. And Cobb had a good game, too, from a usage standpoint. 11 targets for him for the second consecutive game. His market share is 22.4%. The productivity might not be there, but at least he's starting to see volume again. But that is hurting Jordy Nelson, whose target market share is down to 26.3. And you can see kind of why, with him not really being the Jordy Nelson of old. So it's really hard to figure out this Green Bay offense because I was super psyched about Jordy the first 2 weeks, but now I don't know what to think about him or Rodgers or Lacy with his injury or really anybody.
Yeah, it's fair to say that, just like Brandon Gadula of NumberFire had mentioned today on the site, maybe relaxing isn't something we should be doing on this offense at all. Maybe we should start to be a little bit concerned that they're just a much different team than the team that was throwing it all over the place a couple of years ago. Let's jump into the last game, guys, where last night on Sunday Night Football, the Texans were victorious in overtime over the Colts, 26-23, and Lamar Miller finally showed up.
He did, and the matchup was beautiful, and he should have showed up. If he didn't show up, then something was wrong. If you look at running backs against the Colts this season, Theo Riddick finished as a top 5 back in PPR leagues. Jordan Howard, a top 5 back. Amir Abdullah, a top 10 back. C.J. Anderson, a top 10. Even T.J. Yeldon was RB16 against them when they were over in London. So this was a perfect matchup for Lamar Miller. We know his usage was there. He had seen more volume than any other running back without scoring a touchdown in NFL history. So that touchdown progression was coming eventually. Finally hit, finally got in the end zone. He's still seeing elite, very elite market shares in that offense, both in the red zone and outside the red zone. So, in positive matchups like this one, Lamar Miller should be a top-notch option.
Yep, and he, like you said, he came through where he was supposed to, and that's good to see. That it's good to see the Colts are just going to continue to give up production too, because we're definitely going to want to target them go forward. I like seeing spots where I know I can put my fantasy assets in play and expect a good game. DeAndre Hopkins, 15 targets. Jim, talk about how you think that game should have gone. Was it more Jalen Strong than should we have seen more Jalen Strong, or do you think the force feeding of DeAndre Hopkins was appropriate?
I don't know how to read Brock Osweiler. He felt the need to go to Hopkins a lot. 15 targets without Will Fuller healthy. I mean, I don't know what I would have done. Obviously, CJ Fedorowicz was a huge benefactor. He has an 18.8% target market share the past 3 games, so that's good. But it's hard to get jazzed about this team given, a couple of opponents they have coming up. But I guess, the big part is that they do have Dwayne Brown back, and we saw the effects of that on Sunday night. Lamar Miller heading into Sunday had a 26% success rate going left on the season, which is atrocious. League average is around 40%, and the minimum is like 24. But in that game, he carried it left 9 times. He got 92 yards, and 5 of those carries, so 55% of those carries were successful. You do need to track offensive line health, and having Dwayne Brown back healthy on that team is going to make Lamar Miller an infinitely better fantasy asset. And, if you're a Lamar Miller owner, you hope they continue to rely upon him because Brock Osweiler really isn't that good. He'll get better once Fuller is healthy again, but I don't know what I would have done if I were Osweiler, but it clearly, it's not working out so far.
Yeah. And you mentioned Brock Osweiler somewhere in there. Osweiler's a burning trash heap. The offensive line health is definitely going to help that offense stay more productive, fix him. But to tell you the truth, the game itself just went the way we sort of expected it to go. Colts weren't all that effective. And that's going to do it for our show today here. We don't have a lot of time to talk about anything else. So for myself, Chris Gimino, and for our hosts from NumberFire, Jim Sonis and JJ Zacharyson, we'll see you guys next week.